Hi, I'm Natalie, and 3 weeks ago my father called my boss and told him I was an alcoholic who faked sick days because of hangovers. I'd never had a drink problem in my life. But within hours I was sitting in HR being lectured about workplace integrity and mandatory counseling. What my father didn't know was that I'd been tracking his secret credit card statements for months, and I knew exactly where he spent his Tuesday afternoons. So when his wife asked me why he seemed so distant lately, I showed her the receipts from the Roosevelt Hotel and the Venmo payments to someone named Vanessa with very explicit thank you messages. Sometimes the people who try to destroy your reputation forget that you know where all their skeletons are buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I was sitting in my cubicle at Dataflow Marketing Solutions, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing campaign metrics for our biggest client. Austin's skyline stretched above the floor-to-ceiling windows, the September sun casting long shadows across the open office space. I'd been with the company for 2 years, steadily climbing from junior associate to senior campaign manager, and for the first time since college, I felt like I was building something real. My phone buzzed with a text from my stepmother Carol asking if I could swing by for dinner that weekend. Nothing unusual there. Since moving back to Austin after graduation, I'd maintained the weekly family dinners that kept peace in the Brooks household, even though every visit felt like walking through a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled disappointment. Richard Brooks, my father, had never quite forgiven me for choosing marketing over joining his construction empire. Brooks Construction and Development had been his life's work, growing from a small residential contractor to one of Central Texas's most successful commercial developers. He'd always assumed I'd take my place in the family business, despite the fact that I'd shown zero interest in blueprints or building codes since childhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd spent years calling my career choice frivolous, while I was pulling in 6 figures managing digital campaigns for Fortune 500. But Richard was old school, the kind of man who believed real work involved hard hats and steel-toed boots, not spreadsheets and social media analytics. That Tuesday started like any other. I arrived at the office by 7:30, ahead of most of my team, and dove into preparing for our weekly client review. The campaign I'd been leading for a major tech startup was performing beyond expectations, with engagement rates that had our CEO asking me to present to the board next month. For once, everything in my professional life was aligning perfectly. Marcus Chen, my direct supervisor, stopped by my desk around 10 with his usual Tuesday morning coffee run. Marcus was one of those rare managers who actually cared about his team's growth, and over the past year, he'd become something of a mentor. When he handed me my usual oat milk latte, he seemed more serious than usual. "Natalie, can you swing by my office after the client call? There's something we need to discuss." I nodded, assuming it was about the board presentation, or maybe the promotion I'd been hoping for. The client call went smoothly, with our contact praising the campaign's performance and hinting at expanding their budget for Q. I was riding high when I knocked on Marcus's office door an hour later. "Close the door and have a seat," he said, his tone immediately setting off alarm bells. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, his usually warm demeanor replaced by something I'd never seen before. Professional concern mixed with what looked like disappointment. "I received a call this morning," he began, leaning back in his chair, "from someone claiming to be your father." My stomach dropped. "My father? Richard called you? Why would he?" "He was concerned about your attendance," Marcus interrupted, his voice careful and measured. "He mentioned that you've been struggling with alcohol dependency, and that several of your recent sick days were actually related to hangovers." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Marcus, trying to process what I'd just heard. My father had called my boss, had lied about me having a drinking problem, had deliberately tried to sabotage my career. "Marcus, that's not true. I don't have a drinking problem. I've taken maybe 3 sick days in the past 6 months, all legitimate." My voice was steady, but inside I was reeling. I can't believe he would. "Look, Natalie, I've worked with you for 2 years, your performance has been stellar, and I've never noticed any signs of substance abuse. But when a family member calls expressing genuine concern, HR wants to see you this afternoon. It's protocol when these kinds of allegations are made. I felt the walls of my carefully constructed professional life starting to crumble. Allegations? Marcus, you know me, you know my work ethic. I'm here before most people arrive, and I stay late to make sure everything's perfect. I know, and that's exactly what I told HR, but they have to follow procedure. The meeting is at 3 o'clock. Just be honest about everything, and we'll figure this out. I walked back to my desk in a daze, my mind racing. Why would Richard do this? We'd had our differences, sure, but deliberately calling my boss to lie about me having a drinking problem was a level of sabotage I never could have imagined. My hands were shaking as I sat down, and I had to take several deep breaths to keep from falling apart completely. Priya Patel, my cubicle neighbor and closest work friend, immediately noticed something was wrong. You look like you've seen a ghost. What happened in Marcus's office? I glanced around to make sure no one else could hear, then leaned closer to Priya's desk. My father called Marcus this morning, told him I have a drinking problem, and that I've been lying about sick days. Priya's eyes widened. Are you serious? Why would he do that? I have no idea. But now I have to meet with HR this afternoon to discuss my alcohol dependency issues. I made air quotes, my voice dripping with bitter disbelief. That's insane. You barely drink. I've seen you nurse a single beer at company happy hours. Priya shook her head. What are you going to do? I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on work while my mind spun with questions and growing anger. By lunchtime I'd barely eaten anything, my appetite completely gone. The HR meeting loomed ahead of me like a storm cloud, and I kept replaying Marcus's words over and over. At 3 o'clock sharp I found myself sitting across from Janet Walsh, our head of human resources, in a sterile conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and disappointment. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who'd seen every workplace drama imaginable, and her expression was carefully neutral as she opened a manila folder. Natalie, thank you for coming in. I want to start by saying that these conversations are never easy, but they're necessary when concerns are raised about an employee's well-being. She pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes. This morning we received a call from Richard Brooks, who identified himself as your father. He expressed concern about your alcohol consumption and suggested that several recent absences were related to hangovers rather than legitimate illness. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Janet, I want to be completely clear about this. I do not have a drinking problem. I rarely drink alcohol, maybe a glass of wine with dinner occasionally, or a beer at social events. I've taken 3 sick days in the past 6 months, all for legitimate reasons: a migraine, a stomach bug, and a dental emergency. Janet nodded, making notes as I spoke. Can you provide documentation for these absences? Doctor's notes, dental records. For the dental emergency, yeah. The other 2 were single-day illnesses that didn't require medical attention. I paused, then decided to address the elephant in the room. Janet, I need to be honest about something. My father and I have a complicated relationship. He's never approved of my career choice, and he's been increasingly critical of my decision not to join his construction business. Are you suggesting this call was motivated by personal conflict rather than genuine concern? I met her gaze direct. I think my father made a serious error in judgment. Whether it was motivated by our personal issues or genuine misunderstanding, I can't say. But I can absolutely say that his concerns about my alcohol consumption are unfounded. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Janet asking detailed questions about my work performance, attendance record, and personal habits. She was thorough but fair, and by the end, I could tell she was skeptical of Richard's claim. Natalie, based on your employment record and this conversation, I'm not seeing evidence to support the concerns that were raised. However, as a precautionary measure, we're going to require you to attend 2 sessions with our employee assistance counselor. It's standard protocol in these situations. I nodded, understanding that this was probably the best outcome I could hope for, under the circumstances. I appreciate you handling this fairly, Janet, and I want to assure you that my work performance won't be affected by this personal situation. As I walked back to my desk, I felt a mix of relief and simmering rage. Relief that HR had handled things professionally and hadn't immediately assumed the work. Rage that I was now required to attend counseling sessions for a problem I didn't have, all because my father had decided to weaponize my workplace against me. That evening I sat in my apartment, overlooking Lady Bird Lake, staring at my phone and debating whether to call Richard direct. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for his betrayal, but a bigger part of me suspected that confronting him would only escalate whatever game he thought he was playing. Instead, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything that had happened. If Richard wanted to play dirty, I needed to be prepared. I created a detailed timeline of the day's events, saved screenshots of my employment record and attendance history, and started gathering documentation of every interaction I'd had with my father over the past year. As I scrolled through old text messages and emails, a pattern began to emerge. Richard's communications had grown increasingly hostile over the past few months, especially after I'd turned down his latest offer to join Brooks Construction. He'd made several comments about my lifestyle choices and had questioned whether I was stable enough to handle the responsibilities of adult life. At the time, I'd brushed off these comments as typical parental worry mixed with his usual disappointment about my career. But looking at them now with the context of today's events, they felt more sinister, like he'd been building a case against me, gathering ammunition for some future attack. My phone rang around 9 o'clock, Richard's name appearing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, not trusting myself to have a rational conversation. When I played back the message an hour later, his voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey Natalie, just wanted to check in. Carol mentioned you might be coming for dinner this weekend. Hope everything's going well at work. Give me a call when you get a chance." The audacity of it took my breath away. He'd called my boss that morning to accuse me of being an alcoholic, then left a cheery voicemail that evening as if nothing had happened. Either he genuinely believed he was helping me, which seemed unlikely given our recent tensions, or he was playing a much more calculated game than I'd realized. I didn't call him back. Instead, I spent the evening researching employment law and wondering how far Richard might be willing to take this war he'd apparently declared. What I didn't know was that this was just the opening move in a much larger campaign, and that by the end of the week, I'd discover exactly how deep his deceptions ran. The next morning brought another surprise. Marcus pulled me aside before our team meeting with news that made my blood run cold. "I got another call last night," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Same number, same person claiming to be your father. This time he was asking about your work schedule, whether you travel for client meetings, that sort of thing. He called you again. What did you tell him?" "I told him that personnel information is confidential, and that if he had ongoing concerns about your well-being, he should discuss them with you directly." Marcus paused, his expression troubled. "Natalie, I have to ask, is there any reason your father would be trying to gather information about your work schedule?" I shook my head, but my mind was racing. Why would Richard want to know about my travel schedule? What possible reason could he have for that information? "I honestly don't know, Marcus, but I'm starting to think this goes deeper than concern about my drinking habits." "Well, for what it's worth, I didn't tell him anything, and I've made a note in your file about both calls, just to have a record." The rest of the week passed in an increasingly surreal haze. Carol texted twice asking about dinner plans, and Tyler, my half-brother, called to chat about college applications, seemingly oblivious to any family drama. It was as if the attack on my professional life existed in a completely separate universe from our normal family interactions. But on Friday afternoon, everything clicked into place in the most disturbing way possible. I was working late, finishing up a client presentation for Monday, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and cryptic. "Your dad isn't who you think he is. Coffee tomorrow? Grace Williams, private investigator." I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart racing. A private investigator? How did she get my number? And what did she know about Richard? I texted back, "How did you get this number? What's this about?" Her response came quickly. "I've been hired to investigate your father's business practices. Can't say more over text. Kirby Lane Cafe on South Lamar, 10 a.m. tomorrow. Come alone." I set my phone down with trembling hands, my mind spinning with possibility. Someone had hired a private investigator to look into Richard's business, and now she wanted to meet with me. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Not after the week I'd had. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of information I had. Richard's sudden interest in sabotaging my career, his questions about my work schedule, now a private investigator wanting to meet. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than family drama over career choices. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling through my mind. If Richard was willing to lie to my boss about something as serious as alcoholism, what else was he lying about? And more importantly, what lengths would he go to in order to protect whatever secrets he was hiding? The next morning would bring answers I never could have imagined, and set in motion a chain of events that would forever change my understanding of the man I'd called father for 26 years. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, typical for Austin in late September. I dressed carefully in jeans and a simple blouse, nothing that would draw attention, and arrived at Kirby Lane Cafe 15 minutes early. The restaurant was bustling with weekend brunch crowds, families with young children and groups of college students recovering from Friday night adventure. I chose a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance, and ordered coffee, my hands still slightly shaky from nerves and too little sleep. At exactly 10 o'clock a woman in her 40s approached my table. She was average height with short auburn hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the restaurant as she walked. "Natalie Brooks?" she asked, extending her hand. "Grace Williams." I shook her hand, noting her firm grip and the small digital recorder she placed on the table between us. "You said you've been investigating my father. What does that have to do with me?" Grace signaled the waitress for coffee before answering. "I've been hired by the wife of one of your father's business associates to look into some financial irregularities. During my investigation, I discovered that your father has been conducting surveillance on several family members, including you." The words hit me like ice water. Surveillance. What kind of surveillance? Phone records, work schedules, social media monitoring, even hiring someone to follow you occasionally. Grace pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. "I'm sharing this with you because I believe you're in danger, though probably not the kind you're thinking of." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs of me, leaving my apartment, walking into my office building, meeting friends for drinks. There were printed emails that had somehow been accessed from my personal accounts, including job interview correspondence from 6 months ago when I'd been casually exploring other opportunities. "How did he get access to my email?" I whispered, flipping through the invasive documentation of my private life. "Your father has been paying a cybersecurity firm called Digital Solutions Network to monitor your online activity. It's not exactly legal, but it's not technically hacking either. More like sophisticated social engineering and public records mining." Grace leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "Natalie, your father isn't just trying to control your career choices. He's been systematically building a case to have you declared mentally unstable and financially irresponsible." My coffee cup clattered against the saucer as I set it down too hard. "What are you talking about?" "He's been consulting with a lawyer about having you undergo psychological evaluation and potentially gaining legal guardianship over your finances. The alcoholism allegations are just the beginning. He's been documenting what he calls erratic behavior patterns for months." The cafe noise faded into background static as Grace's words sank in. Richard wasn't just disappointed in my career choices, he was actively trying to destroy my independence and take control of my life. The phone call to Marcus wasn't petty sabotage, it was part of a larger plan to paint me as unstable. "But why?" I managed to ask. "Why would he go to these lengths?" Grace's expression darkened. "That's where it gets complicated. Your father has been embezzling money from Brooks Construction for the past 3 years. Small amounts at first, but it's escalated significantly. He's created shell companies, falsified contracts, even skimmed from employee pension funds." I stared at her, struggling to process this information. "You're saying my father is stealing from his own company and several others. He's been using the stolen money to fund a lifestyle his legitimate income couldn't support. Expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and..." Grace paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Regular payments to escort services." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Escort services. Your stepmother hired me because she suspected an affair. What I found was much more extensive. Your father has been seeing multiple women from a high-end escort service for over 2 years. The payments alone total more than $60,000. I felt sick. Carol, who'd always been kind to me despite not being my biological mother, had been living with this betrayal while Richard painted himself as the concerned patriarch worried about his daughter's stability. Where does my potential guardianship fit into this? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the sick logic. If your father can gain legal control over your finances, he can access your inheritance from your grandmother's estate, the trust fund that's been sitting untouched since you turned 25, because you chose to build your own career instead of relying on family money. My grandmother's trust fund, I'd almost forgotten about it, having made a conscious decision to prove myself professionally, without touching the money she'd left me. It was substantial enough to solve Richard's financial problems if he could somehow gain access to it. He's been planning this for months, Grace continued. The surveillance, the documentation of supposed erratic behavior, even encouraging you to stay living in the family home longer than necessary. He's been building a case that you're financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable. I thought about all the times Richard had offered to help me find an apartment, then somehow the conversations always ended with him suggesting I save money by staying at home longer. The comments about my lifestyle choices, the questions about my work schedule, even his sudden interest in my social life, all of it had been calculated. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grace reached into her briefcase and pulled out another envelope, this one thicker than the first. I've documented everything: your father's financial crimes, his personal indiscretions, and his plans regarding your guardianship. My client originally hired me to investigate suspected infidelity, but what I found goes far beyond a cheating husband. She slid the envelope across the table. This contains copies of financial records, surveillance photos of your father's activities, and recorded conversations with the escort service manager. It's enough evidence to send him to prison for embezzlement and fraud. I stared at the envelope, understanding that it contained the power to destroy Richard's life as thoroughly as he'd been trying to destroy mine. Why are you giving this to me instead of going directly to the police? Because I believe you deserve the choice of how to handle this. Your stepmother is planning to file for divorce and turn over the financial evidence to the authorities, but she wanted you to know what was happening first. She's concerned about how this will affect you and Tyler. The mention of my half-brother sent another wave of nausea through me. Tyler was 18, just starting his senior year of high school. He idolized Richard and had no idea that his father was a criminal who'd been stealing money and cheating on his mother for years. Does Tyler know any of this? Not yet. Carol wanted to discuss timing with you first. She's particularly concerned about how the arrest might affect his college applications and mental health. I appreciated Carol's consideration, but the weight of the decision felt crushing. I had the power to protect myself from Richard's machinations, but using it would destroy my family and devastate my brother. Grace seemed to read my thoughts. Natalie, I need you to understand something. Your father isn't going to stop. The guardianship petition is already drafted. He's planning to file it within the next 2 weeks, right after he manufactures another workplace incident to support his case. Another incident? He's been in contact with someone at your company, not your direct supervisor but someone in management. I haven't been able to identify who yet, but the conversations suggest he's planning to escalate his interference with your job. The coffee I'd been sipping turned to acid in my stomach. Richard had someone inside Dataflow Marketing helping him sabotage my career. The conspiracy was wider and more sophisticated than I'd imagined. I need time to think about this, I said, tucking both envelopes into my purse. Grace nodded. I understand, but don't take too long. Your stepmother is planning to confront your father on Monday evening. If you're going to act on this information, it needs to be before then. As I walked back to my car, my mind raced with the implications of everything Grace had told me. Richard wasn't just a disappointed father trying to control his daughter's life. He was a criminal who'd been systematically stealing money, while planning to steal my independence and inheritance. The man I'd spent years trying to please and appease was actually a predator who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment with both envelopes spread across my coffee table, studying the evidence of my father's crime. The financial documents were damning: bank transfers to shell companies, falsified invoices, and pension fund withdrawals that had been redirected to personal accounts. The total amount exceeded $2 million. The surveillance photos were equally disturbing. Richard entering and leaving the Roosevelt Hotel at regular intervals, always on Tuesday afternoons, meeting with the same woman, a striking brunette, who according to Grace's notes was named Vanessa, and worked for an exclusive escort service called Elite Companionship. The most chilling documents were the draft legal papers for my guardianship. The petition painted me as an alcoholic with poor judgment, who was incapable of managing my own affairs. It cited my recent workplace issues, my decision to live at home despite having adequate income for independence, and what it called a pattern of irresponsible financial decisions. Reading Richard's description of me was like looking into a funhouse mirror that distorted every aspect of my life into something unrecognizable. My choice to build my career before touching my inheritance became evidence of financial incompetence. My decision to maintain close family relationships became proof of unhealthy dependence. Even my few sick days from work were twisted into signs of substance abuse and unreliability. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself getting angrier rather than more upset. The sheer calculating cruelty of Richard's plan was breathtaking. He'd been manipulating my emotions and gaslighting me for months, all while planning to steal my freedom and my money. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone call to Marcus wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a systematic campaign to destroy my credibility and independence. By evening, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for Richard to file his guardianship petition or manufacture another workplace crisis. If he wanted to play games with other people's lives and livelihoods, he was about to learn that I could play games too. I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about Elite Companionship and Vanessa specifically. Social media, business registrations, online reviews, anything that might give me insight into the operation Richard had been funding with stolen money. What I found was fascinating. Elite Companionship wasn't just an escort service. It was a sophisticated operation that catered to wealthy businessmen who wanted discretion and exclusivity. Their website, hidden behind password protection and referral requirements, offered sophisticated companionship for discerning gentlemen. Vanessa's profile, which I accessed using credentials Grace had provided, described her as a former marketing executive who specialized in intellectual and emotional connection. Her rates were astronomical: $500 per hour with a 2-hour minimum, plus additional fees for travel and special requests. According to the financial records Grace had provided, Richard had been seeing Vanessa twice a month for over 18 months. The payments totaled nearly $40,000, all funded by money stolen from Brooks Construction and its employees. As I dug deeper into the investigation files, I discovered something even more damning. Richard had been using company credit cards to pay for the hotel rooms where he met Vanessa. The Roosevelt Hotel charges appeared on Brooks Construction corporate accounts, disguised as client entertainment expenses. This gave me an idea that was both elegant and devastating. If Richard wanted to use my workplace against me, I could return the favor by using his workplace against him. But instead of making anonymous phone calls with false accusations, I would present his own employees and business partners with documented evidence of his crime. I spent Sunday researching Brooks Construction's corporate structure, identifying key employees, board members, and major clients. Richard had built his reputation on being a family man with strong moral values, someone who could be trusted with million-dollar construction projects and sensitive client relationships. That reputation was about to be thoroughly and publicly destroyed. Monday morning, I called in sick to work. It wasn't entirely a lie. My stomach had been churning with anxiety since my meeting with Grace, and I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate on marketing campaigns while planning Richard's downfall. Instead, I drove to a FedEx office and prepared a series of packages. Each one contained copies of the financial evidence, surveillance photos, and documentation of Richard's escort service payment. I prepared separate packages for Brooks Construction's 3 board members, their 5 largest clients, and the construction workers' union representative who managed the pension fund Richard had been stealing from. The cover letters were brief and professional. I simply stated that the enclosed evidence documented serious financial irregularities and potential criminal activity at Brooks Construction, and that the recipients might want to review their business relationships accordingly. I sent the packages for delivery Tuesday morning, giving me 24 hours to prepare for the chaos that would follow. That evening, I finally returned Richard's phone calls from the weekend. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful and paternal. "Natalie, I was starting to worry," Carol said. "You might not make it for dinner this week." "Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow afternoon? Say 2 o'clock at the Starbucks on 6th Street. "Of course, sweetheart. Is everything okay? You sound a little stressed." The concern in his voice might have been touching if I didn't know it was completely manufactured. "Just some work stuff I wanted your advice on. Nothing too serious. I'm always here for you, you know that. I'll see you tomorrow at 2. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Richard genuinely had no idea what was coming. He'd been so focused on his secret surveillance and manipulation that he'd never considered the possibility that someone might be watching him in return. Tomorrow would bring the first phase of his destruction, and I intended to be there to watch his world collapse, just as methodically as he'd tried to destroy mine. Tuesday morning dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made Austin feel like a furnace even before sunrise. I woke at 5:30, my internal clock disrupted by the adrenaline that had been coursing through my system for days. The FedEx packages were already in transit, carrying their explosive cargo to every corner of Richard's professional world. I made coffee and sat on my balcony, watching the city wake up below me. Somewhere across town, Richard was probably getting ready for what he thought would be another normal day of running his construction empire, while secretly planning my psychological destruction. He had no idea that his own destruction was already in motion, traveling through the postal system in neat manila envelopes. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol asking if I could stop by the house later to pick up some old college textbooks she'd found in the garage. The mundane normalcy of the request felt surreal given everything I knew about her situation. In a few hours, her husband's crimes would be exposed to his entire professional network, and she was worried about textbooks cluttering the garage. I texted back that I'd swing by after my coffee meeting with Richard, not mentioning that this meeting would likely be the last normal conversation we'd ever have. By evening, he'd either be in police custody or desperately trying to contain a scandal that would destroy everything he'd built. At Data Flow Marketing, I went through the motions of a normal workday, attending meetings and reviewing campaign analytics, while my mind counted down the hours until the packages would be delivered. Marcus stopped by my desk mid-morning to check on how the employee assistance counseling was going. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was attending mandatory therapy sessions for a drinking problem I didn't have while the man who'd caused this situation was about to face consequences for actual crimes. "The counselor seems nice," I told Marcus, which was true. Sarah Chen had been professional and understanding, quickly recognizing that my alcohol issues were more fiction than fact. "I think the sessions will be helpful for dealing with some family stress." Marcus nodded approvingly. "I'm glad HR handled this sensitively. And honestly, your work hasn't suffered at all. If anything, you seem more focused lately." He was right about that. Having a clear enemy and a concrete plan had given me a sense of purpose I'd been missing. For months, I'd been drifting through daily life feeling vaguely unsettled and defensive, unable to pinpoint why family interactions felt increasingly toxic. Now I understood that my instincts had been correct all along. Richard had been waging a psychological war against me, and I'd been fighting back without even realizing it. At noon, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice was gravelly and unfamiliar, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "This is Detective Martinez with Austin PD. I'm calling about some information that was submitted to our financial crimes unit. Are you Natalie Brooks?" My heart rate spiked. "Yes, that's me. We'd like to speak with you about allegations involving Richard Brooks and Brooks Construction. Would you be available to come in this afternoon?" I glanced at the clock. My meeting with Richard was in 2 hours. Could we possibly schedule for later today? I have a prior commitment at 2. That's fine. How about 4 o'clock? And Miss Brooks, I should mention that we've also been in contact with a private investigator named Grace Williams. She indicated you might have additional information relevant to our investigation. After hanging up, I sat in my car in the Dataflow parking lot, trying to process the speed at which events were unfolding. Grace had apparently turned over her evidence to the police independently, which meant Richard's crimes were being investigated through official channels regardless of my personal revenge plan. This actually worked in my favor. While the police built their case based on financial evidence, I could focus on the more personal aspects of Richard's betrayal, the workplace sabotage, the planned guardianship petition, and the systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and independence. The Starbucks on 6th Street was crowded with the usual mix of remote workers and university students. I arrived early and claimed a corner table with a view of the entrance, ordering an iced coffee that I didn't really want but needed something to do with my hand. Richard walked in exactly at 2 o'clock, scanning the room until he spotted me. He looked the same as always, polished khakis, button-down shirt, confident stride that commanded attention. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a successful businessman meeting his daughter for an afternoon chat. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," he said, settling into the chair across from me. Traffic was brutal coming from the office. I wondered if he'd noticed any unusual activity at Brooks Construction today. The packages wouldn't be delivered until later this afternoon, but sometimes word traveled fast in business circles. "No problem. I appreciate you taking the time to meet." Richard flagged down the barista and ordered a black coffee, then turned his attention back to me. "So what's this work situation you wanted to discuss? Everything okay with your boss?" The question was loaded with false concern, given that he'd personally sabotaged my relationship with Marcus just days earlier. I decided to play along with the charade. "Actually, there have been some challenges lately. Someone called my supervisor with concerns about my job performance and personal habits." Richard's expression shifted into what looked like genuine surprise, though I now knew he was capable of sophisticated deception. "That's terrible." "What kind of concerns?" "Allegations about drinking problems and dishonesty about sick days. Really serious stuff that could affect my career long term." "That's outrageous. Who would do something like that?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment, watching his face carefully. Either he was a much better actor than I'd given him credit for, or he genuinely believed his own lies about trying to help me. "I was hoping you might have some insight," I said carefully. "You've always been good at reading people and situations. What kind of person would call someone's boss with false accusations?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, it could be someone who genuinely believes they're helping, even if they're misguided. Or it could be someone with malicious intent, trying to cause professional damage." "Which category do you think is worse?" "Definitely the malicious intent. Someone who genuinely cares about you but makes a mistake in judgment, can be reasoned with, maybe even forgiven. But someone who deliberately tries to destroy your career." He shook his head. "That's a betrayal that's hard to come back from." The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Richard was condemning his own actions while sitting across from me, apparently without any sense of cognitive dissonance. "What would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted had been working against you?" I asked. "I'd want to understand why first. Then I'd make sure they couldn't do it again, even if it was someone in your own family." Richard's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Family makes it more complicated, but not less serious. Trust is the foundation of any relationship. When someone violates that trust, especially someone close to you, there have to be consequences." I nodded slowly. "I completely agree." My phone buzzed with a text notification. Grace Williams had sent a simple message. "Packages delivered. First reactions coming in." Richard glanced at my phone screen but couldn't read the message from his angle. "Everything okay?" "Just work stuff." "Where were we?" "We were talking about trust and consequences," Richard said, his tone becoming more serious. "Natalie, I need you to know that no matter what happens, I'm always on your side. Family loyalty is the most important thing in the world to me." The statement was so absurd given the circumstances that I almost laughed. "That's good to know, Dad. I feel the same way about loyalty." Richard's phone started buzzing insistently. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and declined the call. Within seconds, it started ringing again. "I'm sorry, this seems urgent. Give me just a minute," he answered the phone, his voice professional. "Richard, bro." I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Richard's face transform from mild annoyance to confusion to growing alarm. "What do you mean, financial irregularities? Who sent you this information?" There was a long pause while he listened, his face growing paler by the second. "I need to call you back," he said finally, ending the call with shaking hands. Before he could speak, his phone rang again. This time he looked at the caller ID, and his face went completely white. "I'm sorry, Natalie, but I need to go. There's some kind of emergency at the office." He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee cup. "Can we continue this conversation later? Maybe dinner this weekend?" I nodded sympathetically. "Of course, I hope everything works out." As Richard hurried toward the exit, his phone rang again. I watched through the window as he stood on the sidewalk, gesticulating frantically, while talking to someone who was clearly delivering very bad news. My own phone buzzed with another message from Grace. 3 board members and 2 major clients have called emergency meetings. The union rep is demanding audit of pension funds. It's chaos. I finished my iced coffee slowly, savoring the moment. Richard had spent months systematically destroying my sense of security and self-worth, making me question my own judgment and stability. Now he was getting a taste of what it felt like to have your world crumble around you without warning. But this was only the beginning. The financial crimes investigation would take time to build, and Richard would likely try to contain the damage through legal channels and public relations. I needed to accelerate the timeline and make sure his personal scandals received the same level of attention as his professional crime. I drove home and spent the afternoon preparing for my meeting with Detective Martinez. Grace had provided me with copies of all the evidence, but I wanted to organize it in a way that told the complete story of Richard's systematic campaign against me. The Austin Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit was housed in a bland office building that looked more like an accounting firm than a place where white-collar criminals were brought to justice. Detective Martinez turned out to be a compact woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for coming in. I understand you have information about your father's business practices and some personal issues related to his conduct." I spread out the documents Grace had provided, walking Detective Martinez through the timeline of Richard's surveillance, the planned guardianship petition, and his systematic efforts to sabotage my career. "This is interesting," she said, examining the draft legal document. "Your father was planning to have you declared mentally incompetent, based on fabricated evidence of alcoholism and financial irresponsibility. He called my boss last week, claiming I had drinking problems, and was lying about sick days." Detective Martinez made notes as I spoke. "And you believe this was motivated by his desire to access your inheritance? My grandmother left me a substantial trust fund that I haven't touched. If Richard could gain guardianship, he'd have legal control over those assets." "How substantial?" "About $1–2 million. Detective Martinez whistled softly. "That's a significant motive. Combined with the embezzlement evidence we've received, it paints a picture of someone who was getting desperate financially." She pulled out a thick fold. "We've had a busy day, thanks to some anonymous packages that were delivered to various business associates of your father. The evidence is compelling, but we'll need to verify everything independently. What happens now? We'll continue investigating the financial crime. The embezzlement case is strong, but we need to trace all the money transfers and interview witnesses. As for the personal issues between you and your father, that's more complicated from a legal standpoint." I nodded, understanding that the police could only address the criminal aspects of Richard's behavior. His manipulation and psychological warfare might be morally reprehensible, but they weren't necessarily illegal. However, Detective Martinez continued, "If we can establish a pattern of fraud and deception, it strengthens the overall case. Your testimony about his attempts to manipulate your employment and mental health evaluation could be valuable." I left the police station feeling cautiously optimistic. The financial crimes investigation was proceeding, which meant Richard would face legal consequences for his theft and fraud, but I still wanted him to experience the same kind of personal and professional humiliation he'd tried to inflict on me. That evening, I received a call from Carol. Her voice was strained and exhausted. "Natalie, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Did you know about your father's problems before today? I chose my words carefully. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the full picture until recently. Are you okay? I'm not sure. Richard came home in a panic this afternoon. He's been on the phone for hours with lawyers and accountants. He won't tell me what's happening, but I can tell it's serious. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Tyler's in the middle of college applications, and I don't want this to affect his future, but I can't pretend everything's normal when it's obviously not. I felt a pang of guilt about Tyler, but reminded myself that Richard was the one who'd created this situation. He'd chosen to steal money, cheat on his wife, and manipulate his daughter. The consequences were his responsibility, not mine. Carol, whatever you decide, I want you to know that I support you, and I'll help with Tyler however I can. Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, thinking about the family dynamics that had brought us to this point. Richard had built his entire identity around being a successful businessman and devoted family man. Now both of those pillars were crumbling, and he was probably scrambling to figure out how to salvage his reputation, but I wasn't finished with him yet. The financial crimes investigation would take months to resolve, and Richard would have time to craft a narrative that minimized his personal responsibility. I needed to ensure that his escort service activities and workplace sabotage received the same level of scrutiny as his embezzlement. I opened my laptop and began researching elite companionship more thoroughly. If Richard wanted to play games with other people's professional reputations, it was time for him to experience the same treatment. The escort services website was sophisticated and discreet, but their business model relied on wealthy clients who valued privacy above all else. Richard had been using company credit cards to pay for hotel rooms where he met with Vanessa, which meant there were detailed records of his activity. More importantly, elite companionship operated in a legal gray area that required careful management of their public image. They couldn't afford to be associated with clients who were involved in criminal activities or public scandal. I drafted a careful email to the service's management, identifying myself as a concerned citizen who had discovered evidence of one of their clients using stolen money to pay for service. I attached copies of the financial records showing Richard's embezzlement, and the credit card statements proving he'd used company funds for personal expenses. The email was professional and factual, with no threats or demands for action. I simply suggested that they might want to review their client screening procedures to avoid being associated with criminal activity. I sent the email from an anonymous account, then sat back to wait for the next phase of Richard's downfall to begin. He'd spent months systematically destroying my sense of security and self-worth. Now it was his turn to experience the fear and helplessness that came with having your private life exposed and your reputation destroyed. The difference was that everything I was doing was based on documented facts about his actual criminal behavior, while his attack on me had been built on lies and manipulation. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of irony. Wednesday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made Austin feel alive with possibility. I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to important client presentations, and prepared for what would likely be the most significant day of my professional life. Not because of any meeting or campaign launch, but because I was about to orchestrate the complete destruction of Richard's carefully constructed facade. The anonymous email to Elite Companionship had been sent 12 hours earlier, and I'd already received an automated response acknowledging receipt of my compliance concern. The escort service's quick response suggested they took potential scandals seriously, which boded well for my plan. At Dataflow Marketing, I went through the motions of checking emails and reviewing campaign metrics, but my attention was focused on the phone calls I was expecting. Grace Williams had promised to keep me updated on the fallout from yesterday's package deliveries, and I was eager to hear how Richard's business associates were responding to the evidence of his crimes. The first call came at 9:30. Grace's voice was filled with barely contained excitement. "Natalie, it's chaos over at Brooks Construction. 2 board members showed up unannounced this morning demanding an emergency meeting. The union representative is threatening to freeze all pension fund contributions until a full audit is completed." "What about the client?" 3 major contracts have been suspended pending investigation. The city of Austin is reviewing their relationship with Brooks Construction for all municipal projects. Your father's lawyer has been fielding calls all morning. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with something dark. Richard had spent months methodically destroying my peace of mind and professional reputation. Now he was experiencing the same helpless panic as his world disintegrated around him. There's more, Grace continued. Elite Companionship terminated their relationship with your father this morning. Apparently they don't want to be associated with clients under criminal investigation. The escort service had moved even faster than I'd expected. Their business model depended on discretion and exclusivity, which meant they couldn't afford to be connected to public scandals involving embezzlement and fraud. How do you know about that? I've been monitoring his credit card activity. He tried to book his usual Tuesday appointment with Vanessa, but the charge was declined. When he called to complain, they informed him his account had been permanently suspended. I could picture Richard's confusion and growing desperation as each pillar of his secret life crumbled. The stolen money that had funded his lifestyle was being investigated by police. The escort service that had provided his emotional escape had cut him off. His professional reputation was being systematically destroyed by his own documented crimes. What's he doing now? According to my sources, he's hired a crisis management firm and is trying to contain the damage through legal channels. But it's too late for that. The evidence is too extensive and too well documented. After hanging up with Grace, I sat in my cubicle trying to process the speed at which events were unfolding. In less than 24 hours, Richard had gone from being a respected businessman to a suspected criminal whose personal and professional life was falling apart. But I wasn't finished yet. The financial crimes investigation would take months to resolve, and Richard would have time to craft a narrative that minimized his personal responsibility. I needed to ensure that his manipulation and psychological warfare received the same level of public scrutiny as his embezzlement. I opened my laptop and began drafting a comprehensive timeline of Richard's systematic campaign against me. The document included dates, times, and specific examples of his surveillance, workplace sabotage, and attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent. I cross-referenced everything with the evidence Grace had provided, creating an airtight case for his pattern of manipulation and abuse. The timeline revealed the sophistication of Richard's plan. He'd been documenting my activities for months, building a false narrative of instability and irresponsibility. The phone call to Marcus hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been part of a calculated strategy to destroy my independence and access my inheritance. Marcus appeared at my cubicle around 11, his expression concerned. Natalie, I just got off the phone with someone from Brooks Construction. They were asking about you specifically. My stomach tightened. What kind of questions? They wanted to know about your job performance, attendance record, and whether we'd had any issues with your conduct or reliability. I told them that personnel information is confidential and referred them to HR. I felt a wave of anger mixed with admiration for Richard's persistence. Even as his world collapsed around him, he was still trying to sabotage my career and build his case for my supposed incompetence. Did they say why they were asking? Something about a family legal matter. They mentioned your father specifically, and said they were gathering character references. The guardianship petition. Despite everything that had happened, Richard was still planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll keep it confidential until the legal situation is resolved. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining the full scope of Richard's manipulation, from the fabricated alcoholism allegations to the planned guardianship petition. Marcus listened with growing incredulity, occasionally asking questions that revealed his sharp understanding of workplace dynamics and legal implications. This is insane, he said finally. Your father has been conducting a systematic campaign to destroy your career so he can steal your inheritance. That's exactly what's happening. And he's been doing it while embezzling money from his own company and cheating on his wife. Marcus shook his head. What do you need from me? I need you to document every contact you've had with him, including the phone calls about my supposed drinking problem. And I need you to be prepared to testify about his attempts to interfere with my employment. Absolutely. This is harassment, and it's affecting our workplace. I'll make sure HR has a complete record. That afternoon, I received a call from Detective Martinez with an update on the financial crimes investigation. The news was better than I'd hoped. We've traced the embezzlement back 3 years, she said. The total amount exceeds $3 million. Your father created an elaborate network of shell companies and false contracts to hide the theft. What about the pension fund? That's the most serious charge. Stealing from employee pension funds is a federal crime. The FBI is now involved in the investigation. The escalation to federal involvement meant Richard was facing potential prison time, not just financial penalties. The crimes he'd committed to fund his lifestyle and fuel his manipulation would have consequences that extended far beyond embarrassment or professional setback. When will charges be filed? We're finalizing the evidence this week. I expect arrests will be made by Friday. Friday. In 2 days, Richard would be in custody, and his crimes would become public record. The man who'd tried to have me declared mentally incompetent would be facing federal charges for embezzlement and fraud. That evening, I drove to Carol's house to check on Tyler and see how the family was handling the mounting crisis. The house looked the same from the outside, but I could sense the tension before I even rang the doorbell. Carol answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and a forced smile. "Natalie, I'm so glad you came. Tyler's been asking about you." I found my half-brother in the living room, hunched over his laptop working on college applications. At 18, Tyler was a younger version of Richard, confident, intelligent, and completely unaware of the criminal activity that had been funding his comfortable lifestyle. "Hey, college boy," I said, settling onto the couch beside him. "How are the applications going?" "Good, I think. I'm working on the essay for UT. It's about family influence and personal values." The irony was crushed. Tyler was writing about family values, while his father's criminal behavior was about to become front-page news. "That's a great topic. What are you planning to focus on?" "How Dad taught me about integrity and hard work. About building something meaningful and treating people with respect." I felt physically sick. Tyler genuinely admired Richard and had no idea that his hero was a criminal who'd been stealing money and manipulating family members for years. "Tyler, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you noticed anything unusual about Dad's behavior lately?" "What do you mean? Has he seemed stressed or worried about anything? Any changes in his routine or mood?" Tyler frowned, considering the question. "He's been on the phone a lot more than usual. He's been asking weird questions about you." "What kind of questions? Like whether you've been drinking more lately, or if you seem depressed or unstable." "It was strange because you seem fine to me." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Richard had been trying to manipulate Tyler's perception of me, probably hoping to use my brother's testimony to support his guardianship petition. "What did you tell him?" "That you seem the same as always. Maybe a little stressed about work, but nothing major." I squeezed Tyler's shoulder. "Thanks for being honest. And Tyler, no matter what happens over the next few weeks, I want you to know that I love you, and I'm proud of you." "Why are you talking like something bad is going to happen?" Before I could answer, Richard's voice echoed from the front hallway. "Carol, I'm home." "Is that Natalie's car in the driveway?" The sound of his voice sent adrenaline coursing through my system. In less than 48 hours, he would be arrested for federal crimes. But right now he was still playing the role of concerned father and devoted husband. "We're in the living room," Carol called back, her voice strained. Richard appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and older than his 52 years. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by something brittle and desperate. "Natalie, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you'd be busy with work. I wanted to check on Tyler and Carol. I heard you've been having some business difficulties." Richard's eyes hardened. "Nothing that can't be resolved. Just some misunderstandings with a few clients." "Misunderstandings about financial reporting procedures. Some people don't understand the complexities of construction accounting." The casual dismissal of his criminal activity was breathtaking. Even facing federal investigation, Richard was still trying to minimize and deflect responsibility for his actions. "Dad, what's really going on?" Tyler asked, looking between us with growing concern. Richard's expression softened as he focused on his son. Just some business challenges, Tyler. Nothing for you to worry about. But people keep calling the house, and you seem really stressed. I'm handling it. The most important thing is that you focus on your college applications and your future. I watched Richard interact with Tyler, seeing the manipulation even in this moment of family crisis. He was using Tyler's love and trust as a shield, protecting himself from difficult questions while positioning himself as the sacrificial parent, protecting his son from harsh realities. Richard, I said quietly, I think Tyler deserves to know what's happening. He's 18, not. What Tyler deserves is to finish his senior year without unnecessary stress and drama. The word drama triggered something in me. It was the same dismissive term Richard had used months earlier when I'd questioned his increasing interference in my life. Is that what you call it when someone's life is systematically destroyed by false accusations and manipulation? Drama? Richard's face flushed with anger. I don't know what you're talking about. You called my boss and lied about me having a drinking problem. You hired someone to spy on me and document my activities. You drafted legal papers to have me declared mentally incompetent, so you could steal my inheritance. The silence in the room was deafening. Carol stared at Richard with horror, while Tyler looked back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. That's ridiculous, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. I have documentation, Richard, phone records, financial statements, surveillance photo. I know about the shell companies, the embezzled money, and the escort service. Carol gasped. Escort service? You've been paying for prostitutes with stolen money while planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. Elite Companionship has detailed records of your activity. Richard's face went completely white. You don't understand the pressures I've been under, the business, the family obligations, the constant stress. So you decided to steal money and cheat on your wife while trying to destroy your daughter's life and independence. I was trying to protect you. You're not capable of managing your own affairs. You're too trusting, too naive. I'm capable enough to uncover your crimes and expose them to the authority. Richard stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when he realized the full scope of what I'd done. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a kind of grudging respect. You did this. The packages, the investigation, everything. I defended myself against someone who was trying to destroy my life. The fact that you're a criminal just made the evidence easier to gather. Tyler stood up abruptly. I don't understand what's happening. Dad, is this true? Are you really in trouble with the police? Richard looked at his son, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed genuinely ashamed. Tyler, I made some mistakes, business decisions that I thought were necessary but were actually illegal. I finished multiple felonies, including theft from employee pension fund. Federal charges will be filed on Friday, I continued, watching Richard's face crumble as the reality of his situation sank in. The FBI is involved now. Carol started crying quietly, while Tyler sank back onto the couch looking stunned. Richard stood in the middle of the room, his empire of lies and manipulation finally collapsing around him. I need to call my lawyer, he said finally. Your lawyer already knows. The evidence is overwhelming. Richard looked at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with hatred. You're not the naive little girl I thought you were. No, I'm not. But it took your systematic abuse to teach me how to fight back. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the confrontation with Rich. For months he'd been manipulating my emotions and gaslighting me into questioning my own judgment. Tonight, I'd seen the mask slip completely. He wasn't a concerned father or successful businessman. He was a criminal who'd been using his family as cover for his crimes, while planning to steal from the people who trusted him most. The final phase of his downfall was already in motion. Tomorrow the local news would pick up the story of Brooks Construction's federal investigation. Friday would bring arrest warrants and perp walks. Within a week, Richard would be facing decades in prison while his professional reputation lay in ruins. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed my own power and independence. The woman who'd been attending mandatory counseling sessions for a drinking problem she didn't have was now the person who'd exposed a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme and protected other potential victims from a predator who'd been masquerading as a pillar of the community. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Richard's victim, I was his nemesis, and I'd won. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel sharp and defined. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety but from anticipation. Today would mark the official end of Richard's criminal enterprise, and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The arrest happened exactly as Detective Martinez had predicted. At 8:15 a.m., federal agents appeared at Brooks Construction headquarters with warrants for Richard's arrest on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and theft from employee pension funds. Local news crews had somehow gotten wind of the operation and were already positioned outside the building when Richard was escorted out in handcuffs. I watched the coverage from my office at Dataflow Marketing, surrounded by colleagues who'd gathered around Priya's computer to watch the breaking news story. The sight of Richard being led away by FBI agents while reporters shouted questions felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. "Holy shit, Natalie," Priya whispered. "That's your father." I nodded, unable to speak as the full weight of the moment hit me. For months, Richard had been systematically destroying my sense of reality and self-worth. Now he was being destroyed by his own documented crimes, broadcast live on television for the entire city to see. Marcus appeared at my shoulder, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern. "Are you okay? Do you need to take some time off?" "Actually, I'm better than I've been in months. This has been a long time coming." The news coverage continued throughout the morning, with reporters digging into Brooks Construction's business practices and interviewing former employees who'd suspected financial irregularities for years. The pension fund theft was particularly damaging to Richard's reputation, as it had directly harmed working families who'd trusted him with their retirement security. By noon, the story had expanded beyond the financial crime. An investigative reporter from the Austin Business Journal had somehow obtained information about Richard's escort service activities and was connecting them to his use of company credit cards for personal expenses. The combination of embezzlement and adultery painted a picture of a man whose public persona had been completely fraudulent. Carol called me around 2 o'clock, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Natalie, I need to ask you for help. Tyler's been getting calls from reporters asking about his father. He's falling apart." I left work early and drove to the house in Cedar Park, passing news vans parked along the street, and reporters doing stand-ups in front of the family home. The media attention had transformed our quiet suburban neighborhood into a circus, with neighbors peering out windows and pointing at the activity. Inside the house, Tyler was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, his college application materials scattered across the coffee table. Carol sat beside him, rubbing his back while tears streamed down her face. "How did this happen?" Tyler asked when he saw me. "How did Dad become a criminal without any of us knowing?" I sat down across from them, choosing my words carefully. "Your father has been living a double life for years. He became very good at hiding his true nature from the people who loved him. But you knew, didn't you? That's why you've been acting strange lately." I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't understand the full scope until recently. When he called my boss and lied about me having a drinking problem, I started investigating. Carol looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You're the one who exposed him." I gathered evidence and turned it over to the authorities, but Richard exposed himself through his own action. Tyler stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the news crews on the street. "Everyone at school is talking about it. My teachers keep asking if I'm okay. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth. Your father made choices that you had nothing to do with. You're not responsible for his crimes or his lies." "But what about college? What about my applications? Who's going to want to accept the son of a convicted felon?" I felt a stab of guilt about Tyler's situation, but reminded myself that Richard was the one who'd created this mess. His son was suffering because of choices he'd made, not because of any actions I'd taken. "Tyler, you're brilliant and talented, and any college would be lucky to have you. Your father's crimes don't define you or limit your potential." Carol wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulder. "We're going to get through this, all of us. But first, I need to figure out what our financial situation looks like. The practical implications of Richard's arrest were staggering. Brooks Construction would likely be forced into bankruptcy, which meant Carol and Tyler would lose their primary source of income. The family home might have to be sold to pay restitution to Richard's victims. Their comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle was about to disappear overnight. I've already contacted a divorce attorney, Carol continued. I can't be married to someone who's stolen money from working families and cheated on me with prostitutes. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping Carol organize financial documents and contact the various professionals she'd need to navigate the legal and economic chaos ahead. It was tedious work, but it felt good to be solving problems instead of being the target of someone else's manipulation. That evening, after Tyler had gone to his room to work on homework and try to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Carol and I sat on the back porch drinking wine and watching the sunset over Lake Travis. I keep thinking I should have seen the signs, Carol said quietly. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he'd get defensive when I asked about business trips. Richard was very good at compartmentalizing his life. He made sure none of us saw the full picture, but you figured it out, only because he made the mistake of attacking me direct. If he'd left me alone, he might have gotten away with everything. Carol laughed bitterly. So his own arrogance brought him down, pretty much. He got so focused on trying to control me that he didn't realize I was documenting his crime. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, processing the magnitude of everything that had changed in just a few days. A week ago, Carol had been the wife of a successful businessman, living in a beautiful house and planning for her son's college education. Now she was facing divorce, bankruptcy, and single parenthood. What are you going to do now? I asked. Start over, I guess. I have my real estate license, though I haven't used it in years. Tyler and I will probably have to move somewhere smaller, maybe an apartment near his school so he can finish senior year without too much disruption. What about the house? The government will probably seize it as part of the asset forfeiture process. Richard used stolen money to pay the mortgage, which means it's technically proceeds from criminal activity. The legal complexities of untangling Richard's financial crimes would take years to resolve. Meanwhile, the innocent members of his family would have to rebuild their lives from scratch. Carol, I want you to know that I'll help however I can. Tyler's college expenses, living costs while you get back on your feet, whatever you need. She looked at me with surprise. Natalie, you don't have to do that. Yes, I do. Tyler is my brother, and you've always been kind to me. Richard's crimes shouldn't punish the people who cared about him. Over the following weeks I watched Richard's empire completely crumble. Brooks Construction filed for bankruptcy, laying off dozens of employees and leaving multiple construction projects unfinished. The company's assets were seized by federal authorities to pay restitution to pension fund victims and other creditors. Richard himself remained in federal custody, unable to make bail due to flight risk concerns and the severity of the charges against him. His lawyer had attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors were demanding significant prison time given the scale of the embezzlement and the harm to working families. The escort service scandal continued to generate media attention, particularly after Vanessa gave an interview to a tabloid newspaper describing Richard as a lonely man who'd spent thousands of dollars seeking emotional connection. The interview painted a pathetic picture of someone so emotionally stunted that he'd had to pay for intimacy while destroying his real relationships through lies and manipulation. Meanwhile, my own life began to transform in ways I'd never expected. The mandatory counseling sessions with Dr. Chen had evolved into productive therapy focused on recovering from psychological abuse and rebuilding my sense of self-worth. Marcus had recommended me for a promotion to senior account director, recognizing that my analytical skills and attention to detail had been instrumental in managing our most challenging campaign. Most importantly, I'd finally accessed my grandmother's trust fund and was using it to build something meaningful. I'd started a nonprofit organization focused on providing financial literacy education and legal support to families affected by white-collar crime. The Richard Brooks Foundation for Financial Justice felt like the perfect way to transform his legacy of theft and manipulation into something that actually helped people. Tyler had ultimately decided to defer college for a year, choosing to work and help Carol rebuild their lives rather than accumulating student debt while their financial situation remained uncertain. I'd offered to pay his tuition regardless, but he wanted to prove his independence and maturity by contributing to the family's recovery. "I need to know that I can handle adversity," he told me over coffee one Saturday morning. "Dad always made everything seem easy, but that was because he was cheating. I want to earn my success honestly." The comment revealed how much Tyler had matured in the months since Richard's arrest. He'd gone from idolizing his father to understanding that true strength came from facing challenges with integrity rather than taking shortcuts that harmed other people. 6 months after Richard's arrest, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The judge had been particularly harsh in her sentencing, noting that Richard's crimes had not only stolen money but had betrayed the trust of employees who'd counted on him for their financial security. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery while Richard stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit. He looked older and smaller than I remembered, his confidence completely drained by months of incarceration and legal proceeding. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Richard had turned to look at me for the first time since his arrest. "I'm sorry," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he was apologizing to his victims, his family, or specifically to me. I didn't the time for words between us had passed months earlier. Richard would spend the next 12 years reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this moment, while I would spend that time building the life he'd tried to steal from me. After the hearing, I drove to Lady Bird Lake and sat on the shore watching kayakers navigate the calm water. The Austin skyline stretched out before me, full of possibilities and new beginnings. I'd started dating someone from the nonprofit world, a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes and understood the complexities of family betrayal. We were taking things slowly, building trust and intimacy based on honesty rather than manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol, who'd successfully rebuilt her real estate career and was finally feeling financially stable again. "Tyler got accepted to UT with a partial scholarship. We're celebrating at the Italian place tonight if you want to join us." I smiled, and texted back that I'd be there. The family Richard had tried to destroy through his greed and manipulation had ultimately grown stronger without him. We'd learned to support each other based on love and respect rather than fear and control. As I walked back to my car, I reflected on everything that had changed since that morning, when Richard had called my boss with lies about my drinking habits. He'd thought he was beginning the final phase of his plan to control my life and steal my inheritance. Instead, he'd triggered a chain of events that had exposed his true nature and freed his family from his toxic influence. The scared, confused woman who'd sat in HR being lectured about workplace integrity was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept manipulation or abuse from anyone. Richard had inadvertently taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that the people who try to make you question your own sanity are usually the ones with the most to hide. His crimes had been motivated by greed, but his systematic campaign against me had been driven by something deeper: fear that I might become strong enough to see through his lies and expose his true nature. In the end, his fear had been completely justified. I'd started as his victim, but I'd finished as his destroyer, and unlike his crimes, my victory had been built on truth, evidence, and the courage to fight back against someone who'd tried to steal not just my money, but my very sense of self. The sun was setting over Lake Travis as I drove home to my new apartment, leaving the courthouse and Richard's failed empire behind me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I would face them as someone who knew her own strength and refused to be anyone's victim, ever again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.